Motherfuckers! Let's talk about the throat and its ability to respond to childhood trauma many years later. This is the short and easy summary for the long form version of the episode for detail nerds who want to hear scientific excerpts. Take a look at the links listed here. Either way, please note that there is a brand new option for the extra fucking geeks around here. This week, there's another version with results, limitations, and extended methods included, as well as extra commentary. It is also linked below. Maybe we do this forever, maybe not. But the results of this paper were incredible. And if you want to talk research, yeah, we'll fucking talk research. And we'll do so today as we explore the paper that I told you to hold out for. Investigating past trauma in laryngo-responders versus non-laryngo-responders, piloting new methods in an exploratory study. It's by Becker et al. From the Journal of Voice, 2022. Let's begin, as usual, with the introduction. We know by now, hopefully, if you've been here for more than a few minutes, that the body responds to stress in undiagnosable and debilitating ways. What we might not know is stress counts as anything that offsets balance mentally, physically, and/or emotionally, and the three are related. A single dose of stress can be significant, but regularly or chronically repeated stress responses establish a basis for lasting diseases, dysfunctions, and pathologies. We make a point to say stress responses because the original stress event doesn't have to continue to be present. The brain or body may continue to react as though it is. Common provokers are early childhood traumas, depression, and anxiety. Common outcomes include digestive disorders like IBS. We know that stress, trauma, abuse, and mistreatment lead to somatic impairments, potentially with significant delay. What we don't know is why some biological systems are affected instead of others, and why this is seen variably between individuals. One area of trauma-inspired dysfunction is thought to be the throat, specifically the larynx, which takes care of speaking and swallowing. Muscle tension dysphonia, as we've heard recently, is anecdotally connected to stress load and has the outcome of losing the ability to speak. It is characterized by excessive, abnormal tension in the muscles around the larynx, voice box, and it causes the vocal cords to overexert and work inefficiently, resulting in a strained, hoarse, or weak voice, vocal fatigue, and throat pain or tightness. Although the link between imbalance and eventual voice loss, or any other functional disorder, is not currently understood, there is some common wisdom that somatic ailments are somehow symbolic, or reflective, or awfully coincidental presentations of prior life experiences. For instance, not being able to stand up for oneself could manifest in back issues, or, in this case, not being able to speak for self-protection or expression during or after a stressful event could lead to later voice impairments. Psychosomatic illness, therefore, could be metaphorical or directly representative of traumatic events. Another theory is that the most at-risk part of the body will simply accept the dysfunction caused by the stress. The imbalance will strike here. If the voice or throat is already compromised, it could acquire the burden of the trauma. And lastly, there is the possibility that particular personality plus situational factors come together to cause some people to experience voice and throat responses, while others don't. In light of these unknowns and observations, researchers began referring to those affected as laryngo-responders, individuals who, for unknown reasons, experience distress alongside changes in the throat, causing voice or sensational disorders. Some folks report pain or vocal alterations during or after upset. Others do not. What is the difference between the two? Of course, the diverse nature of the stress experience is probably part of this discrepancy. Stress itself isn't a determinedly negative thing, though it is marked by tension and it comes with change. Some stressful events are positive, like new jobs, babies, marriage. Others are traumatic. They cause a degree of pain, suffering, and functional compromise. Major life events, social changes, disasters, and accidents are some examples of long-lasting stressors that alter thought, emotional, and living patterns long term. Even after the events conclude, the imbalance that they caused can live on in the body, like perpetual echoes. This is confusing to the individual and medical science due to the variable nature of physical disorders. In terms of laryngo-responders, the connection between past trauma and vocal defect seems clear for some, but it has not been well investigated or documented. These points are the motivations behind this study, where childhood trauma and neglect were compared against biological stress responses of the present. The purpose was to improve identification of throat responders, understand differences in the traumatic histories between laryngo-responders versus non-laryngo-responders, and better understand how communication of prior trauma may be implicated in vocal dysfunction. In other words, if disclosure and support weren't available, could this contribute to later vocal box impairment? And how did they begin to address these complex questions? Methods. Here's the thing. The authors did not have tools to do this investigation, so they made some. Instrument design. First, the authors created the Physical Report Form, PRF. This was a Show Me Where Trauma Has Touched You tool using a genderless mannequin split into 6 planes, where participants marked the areas most affected by dysfunction or pain. They were given paper copies of the diagram and used colored pencils for expression of these responses. Secondly, the Ideal Internal and External Communication Questionnaire, IECQ, tool was developed to qualify the ideal communication circumstances post-trauma. In other words, did the individual receive compassion and support as they would hope? Were they able to disclose safely? Previous tools we've heard about, like the Childhood Trauma Questionnaire, for instance, do not include questions about this post-traumatic experience, which the authors note may explain differences in long-term stress responses, since they are examining the effects of trauma on the throat. Unwelcome, stressful, or punitive communication about childhood trauma is of utmost concern. So, the IECQ specifically examines how individuals communicated with themselves post-trauma. For starters, if they addressed their experience compassionately and emotionally to them. And it also explores communicating outwardly about the events. How were their words received? These questions were answered via a simple scale where participants marked how ideal each experience was along a 100-millimeter line. For later data analysis, this scale was broken into categories of low, medium, and high idealness. Those are the tools. So who are we looking at? Participants. Participants were cisgender women from 19 to 65 years old who responded to flyers in the Pittsburgh area. This demographic reflects the population most likely to have voice disorders per vocal pathology clinics. A number of health conditions ruled out some participants for the study, such as anything easily diagnosable, like asthma, respiratory disorder, pregnancy, etc. Settings and procedure. This research was conducted in a university laboratory space where they completed questionnaires and were given the option to opt out of the study when the trauma-related probes began. In addition to the tools already discussed, they answered the childhood trauma questionnaire short form, which was further used to create a score of adverse childhood experiences. They also responded to the trauma history questionnaire and dissociative experiences scale. And this is where we talk about results for the SUPERNERDs, and they are fascinating. Really go beyond the intended scope of this study and give you a few extra things to think about if you're into that sort of thing. For instance, let me share, as a self-validated asshole, this line with everyone. Quote, "The following regions had more participant responses than the vulnerable system of interest, the larynx. Abdomen and digestive system, 83%. Back neck, 72%. Shoulder, 69%. Chest and respiratory, 69%. And the head, 59%. So 4 out of 5 participants reported what? Abdominal responses to trauma. Trauma affects and weakens the guts, contributing, perhaps, to vocalization and walking gait issues, as we've been speaking about. Anyways, for the rest of the most impactful results, check those links below. Nerds, stay tuned. And here we go, bravely, into the findings details. Otherwise, let us continue with our discussion. Beck et al. Tell us the larynx and relatedly its acoustic vocal product and other functions such as swallowing and breathing might constitute a vulnerable body system in some individuals. The most reported stress responses in the present sample included stomach aches, heart palpitations, and headaches, all of which are generally appreciated as, quote, classic stress responses. Descriptive data collected via the custom-made PRF identified that 21% of participants without current voice complaints acknowledge their larynx as a body region that predictably and/or habitually responds during times of stress. So, while it is more common for other areas to be afflicted by stress and phantom stress responses, including the abdomen, chest, neck, back, shoulders, heart, lungs, and head, reactions that we commonly accept as signals of anxiety or strain. Still, about 1 in 5 participants of this study identified that the larynx, not the back of the neck, could also be afflicted by stress in a consistent manner, not a one-off or uncommon experience that might only be coincidentally correlated with a stress event. Those laryngo-responders self-reported nearly 3/4 more experienced and severe trauma than non-laryngo-responders in each category of trauma. This validates the idea that long past personal history might cause disorder of the throat and the voice. Most significantly, though, emotional neglect was most commonly indicated by laryngo-responders, 83% compared to only 43% of non-laryngo-responders. Now, we can never make definitive statements from one single study, and it is possible that emotional neglect could cause personal characteristics such as shyness that explain the vocal difficulties. And yet, it is also possible that with future research, the connection between emotional trauma, inability to successfully discuss the trauma, and later physiological disorder of the vocal region could be confirmed. Based on the lackluster scores in ideal communication after a trauma, it appears that those with emotional neglect histories failed to show up for themselves, with only 51% in ideal communication on average, and that others failed to show up for them. A similar 45 out of 100 ranking for ideal communication from external sources. non-emotional neglectees experienced far more supportive communication, roughly 75% ideal scores for both self and other communication experiences. This is not the case for those who have not had their emotional needs met. The author's findings implicate childhood emotional neglect as a causative factor that could decrease easeful or effective communication down the road and further validate the results as being cohesive with clinical observations. They say, for example, it is not uncommon for a patient who presents with a functional voice disorder to disclose that they are sometimes known to limit their verbal communication at a general level, to hold in their verbal acknowledgement of emotional state, or to engage in ostensibly inhibitory behaviors such as breath holding and laryngeal muscular hyperfunction. While the present study did not address the cohort's physiological responses to stress, the data are at least theoretically compatible with a behaviorally inhibitory framework. In other words, although this study didn't include measures of physiological responses in real time, but rather relied on self-reports about previous experiences, the research suggests that post-traumatic behavioral patterns could be established during early childhood neglect and other ACEs, which then carry through into adulthood, including learning to somatically inhibit communication attempts at the larynx. And with that, let's hit the conclusion. From this research, it seems not only logical and anecdotal, but perhaps also statistically validated. Trauma affects the ability to communicate. The isolative environment and difficulty explaining distressing emotional events that are common in the traumatic aftermath, or even worse, dismissal and punishment for disclosure, could teach the body not to allow communication to take place with a physiological target. One doesn't have to try hard to imagine that emotional neglect corresponds with an environment of difficult or lacking communication. We learn how to talk to ourselves based on how others speak to us. This result suggests that in the childhood home, the individual has already been conditioned to avoid self-disclosure, self-comfort, and self-compassion at the time that the adverse events take place. They cannot turn to themselves for support, and the same result is obtained if attempting to discuss the happenings with others. This further concretizes the learned behavior of not speaking ideally to themselves, based on that rejection from others. In general, when it comes to care, if we don't receive it outwardly, we fail to give it to ourselves inwardly. One might suggest that the antidote is to begin ideal self-communication to break the cycle of silence psychologically and physiologically. And with that, enjoy your reflections. Get out of here. I'll talk to you next week. Or continue on to the limitations and future directions of the study in the super geek version of this episode, linked below. Thank you for being here. Please don't stop expressing yourself or stop yourself from expressing to yourself. Do mind all the various systems that could be impacted by stress or artifactual stress responses from the distant past. And I'll talk to you soon, larynx permitting. Take care. Hail yourself. And cheers, y'all. Bye-bye.